being live streamed. There it goes. Okay. All right. Shall I wait 1 second till you come back? Are we good to go? Okay, so here we go. We've spent a fair amount of time on the dream. We could go back to it because I really only brought the Maral, like I didn't bring anything from the Ramat Valley, etc. And so if people want that, text me or whatever, and I will. I am sharing the screen, right? Yeah, it says I'm sharing it. Okay. Anyway, let me know, and I can go back and I can bring other perushim on that dream itself. But I thought I would go further. There's a small little concluding piece in chapter 2, and then we'll start in on chapter 3. So the concluding piece on chapter 2 is the king has heard Daniel's. Daniel tells him what it was that was in the dream, because remember, Nebuchadnezzar had forgotten what was in the dream, and gave him an interpretation of what was in the dream, and gave him an explanation as to why this was the kind of dream that God sent to a king. And so that's all what Daniel had done. And the king recognizes all this. And so now we have the closing scene from this first story, which is V'dayin Malchat Nebuchadnezzar nafal on Pohi. The Daniel Sagad. Wow. Umincha v'nichochim amar l'nasacha lay. Okay. Then King Nebuchadnezzar fell on his face to Daniel. In Sagad is the Hebrew word for a mosque, which is a place where the Arabs, the way that all Arabs, the way that Muslims pray is they actually prostrate themselves. That's this word sagad, and we call a mosque a misgad because it's a place where people, and now the Hebrew word usually for prostrating is lehishtachavot. So that would be the Hebrew translation of it. But Sagad, that's what this Sagad is. It's as though Nebuchadnezzar it seems as though Nebuchadnezzar is treating Daniel as though Daniel is a god. And then it says, Umincha v'nichochin amar l'asachale. And he said that a mincha and nichochin. So we recognize those words. First of all, mincha, in our worship of God, mincha is the grain offering, but it's a sacrifice. The word mincha, however, has shown up in Sefer Bereshit several times and shows up again in this week's parsha, last week's parsha, in this past week's parsha, actually. And because it also means a tribute. So a mincha is something that an inferior gives to the superior. All right. So it's as though Nebuchadnezzar is recognizing Daniel as being greater than he is. which is pretty weird. Okay, for somebody who was as egotistical, right? This Rosh Shel Zahav kind of person of Nebuchadnezzar, it's pretty weird that he's recognizing anybody at all as being greater than he is, but he's giving this mincha. Nichochin is like, right, reach nichoach, it's this sweet, it's something, it's the sweet incense, the sweet savor, is to be given, and that's what he said, linasacha, right? And that's to be poured out to him, to be presented to him. And it sounds as though it's mamish being presented to Daniel. And so that I'm going to give you the whole story because it's just four verses long, and then we'll talk about how the Malbim sees it and how Ramat Vali sees it, which are, they see it differently. So then what comes next? Then Anna, I need to make this bigger because my eyes are not good enough in this light to see. All right, bigger. Hold on. Normally, I have a touch screen, so you would think I could make it bigger by just pulling it larger, but that doesn't seem to want to work. And I can zoom my text. That will make it better. There we go. Sorry about that. Okay. Anei Makala Daniel. Ba'amar. Min ksho di ala hakon hu. Ella. It's hard for me because I'm used to making a kuf in place of the hey, and the way the Aramaic is phrased, there's no real place to put that kuf sound. Okay, Ella elahin umarei malchin v'galei razin di yachalta lemigla razadana. So the king answers Daniel, and he says, "All right, so we didn't hear Daniel say anything." Malbim addresses this and says that Daniel objected to the king bowing down to him and says, "I'm not God." And so the king is answering Daniel's objection. That's how Malbim reads what's going on here. And he says, okay, in truth, it's really true that your God is the God of gods. Okay, Elokei Elokim, Umarei Malchin, and the master of kings, and the revealer of secrets, that you were able to reveal this secret to me, but the to me part is missing, right? You were able to reveal this secret because, God is like speaking through you. I see you as a prophet of God, and I was bowing down. I wasn't bowing down to you. No, I get that. I was bowing down to you as a representative of God. And then Malcha L'Daniel Rabbi, so then the king elevates those people who've had Aramaic classes with me in the past. We've talked about the two different verbs that we have in Aramaic for gadol. Legadel somebody, well, there are lots of meanings of it. One, legadel, children, means to raise them, okay, from little bitty as they grow, okay. Gidulim are growths, things that grow. But gadol can be large. Gadol can be important. Gadol can actually sometimes be used in terms of many or a lot of things. Aramaic separates the first meaning of elevating, raising, growing in importance as compared to the sense of becoming many. Okay. And they have two different verbs in the Aramaic. So when you see the word Rabbi, that word is something which is becoming more important. as opposed to this word, sagi, which is sometimes spelled as it is here with the sin, and in other dialects or ways of writing Aramaic, they'll spell it with a samach. But either way, sagi always has the meaning of many, and Rabbi has the meaning of great, as an important, etc. So he made Daniel great. Umatnan Ravravin Sagim Yhavle, and he gave Daniel Sagim many, and Ravravan, which is, that's this Rav, okay? Important, significant kinds of gifts, but many significant gifts he gave to him. Now notice this word matnan is like our word in Hebrew, matana, gifts. If you give a gift to your peer or you give a gift to your child, it's matanot. We give matan, it come Purim, next holiday, almost the next holiday. We have Tu B'Shvat in between. But Purim, we give matanot le'avyonim. Now, on the one hand, we're not supposed to look down on the poor. But if we're in a more secure position financially than they are, then at least on the financial scale, we're in the superior position. They're in the inferior position. And a gift from a superior to the inferior, or even from a peer to a peer, those kinds of gifts are called matanot, latet, as opposed to the mincha, which is a tribute, something which an inferior gives to the superior. And for sure that humans essentially give to God. The first place we see the word mincha is by Cain and Hava, when Cain and Abel offered mincha to God. So he changed, you see the change in words here from mincha to matana. And Yahav is the shorish for, the Aramaic shorish for giving, which is the yud and the aleph can switch out. That's the root ahava. That love is engendered by people giving of themselves to the other, and that not so that they'll love me, but when I give to somebody else, that increases my love for them. Okay, when you give to children, when you give to your grandchildren, when you give to your friends, when you give, it increases your sense of love to them. Okay, and so that's the relationship between this Aramaic word, Yahav, and the ahava that we have in Hebrew. So to go on, leaving the Aramaic aside, right, to what happens, what else is the king going to do? He's elevated him. He's given him many significant gifts, right? He recognizes that, no, Daniel is not greater than he is. Now it's a matana. It's not a mincha. Hashlate al kol medinot Bavel, and he caused him to rule, right? Shilton. You know, if the Hebrew is good enough for people who are going to listen to this, I'm bringing it. This is, he caused him to rule over the entire country of Bavel. And again, we have Varav, Signin, Al Kol Chachime Bavel, and he made him the person in charge over all of the wise men of Bavel. Because if you remember, all of the wise men of Bavel, of their various different sorts, were not able to recall the dream, nor were they able to provide an explanation of it. And which should remind you very much of the story that we just heard in the Parsha this past Shabbat, when Paro's Khartoumim and wise men, etc., were not able. He Paro did remember his dream, they still couldn't interpret it. And so they had to call Yosef to do it. And here, Nebuchadnezzar wasn't even able to remember the dream, and all the various Chachamim had failed. Now, we saw that Nebuchadnezzar had threatened to kill all of them. Actually, he'd given the command to kill all of them. And Daniel staved that off until he was able to provide the answer that the king was looking for. And so evidently the decree to kill all of the Chachmei Bavel was nullified, which, if you think about it, is kind of an interesting thing. When we get to the Purim story, which granted is not Bavel, okay, but it's the successors of Bavel. After Bavel is going to come Medayu Paras, right? That's the arms of silver, and is the next kingdom. And Achashverosh, the whole Purim story takes place there. And one of the things that we hear in Megillat Esther is that when a decree is made by the king and it's sealed by the king's ring, etc., it can't be changed. You can have something else that can modify it, etc., right? So Mordechai and Esther were able to add on a rule that said that the Jews were allowed to defend themselves, but they weren't able to nullify the decree. And, the king says, because it's known, you can't nullify the decree. But we see here, not so many years earlier, in the Babylonian system of government, which was what had preceded the Persian Median one, and you would think that the Persian Medians would have continued. They do continue a fair amount of the policy kinds of stuff that Nebuchadnezzar put into place. They, somewhere along the line, they changed it from it being for the king at least to be able to nullify his own rule to not being able to nullify the rule. And it just sort of it struck me, what is this? But, this is telling us that, 50 years earlier, it was possible to do it. There's been a change in how things happen. And then the last line in this little bit here to finish off chapter 2, Daniel ba min malcha, Umane al avidta di medinat Bavel l'shadrach meshach va'Abednego v'Daniel bitra malcha. So then Daniel requested of the king and appointed over the work that he was given to do over the nation of Bavel. He appointed and gave jobs to, so Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah. These are his 3 friends who had been with him from his teenage days when they were in school together, learning the language, etc. And they're also from Zerah Melucha. They're also from the tribe of Yehuda. And these are their Babylonian names that were given to them by the guy who was in charge, whose name I'm blanking on. Ashpenaz, I think, was his name. All right. And so he gives them, and that, by the way, sort of sets the scene for what's going to happen next. All right. Malbim reads these 4 verses, and he says to us that it's problematic, right? That Nebuchadnezzar tried to worship Daniel. He explains that this part right here, that the king answering Daniel because Daniel protested, that was from the Malbim. okay, and backed off on it, etc. And so then he says, so what's this Adain here, this Az Zai, basically? What's the then? So then when the king saw that Daniel wasn't willing to be worshipped, so, and not even like as a prophet or whatever, to have that kind of status, so the king had to figure out some other elevated status to give to Daniel. And so this then, according to Malbim, is in response to the two verses that have gone before. Ramat Vali, I mean, it's not that he does it exactly differently. Ramat Vali, however, acquits. Let's see if I can switch my share. If I just do a new share. Okay, I'm going to let you see the text with me. So, Ramat Vali, little harder to read. Here we go. So Ramat Vali says, look, the king had remembered his dream once he heard it from Daniel's mouth, and he recognized in the Ferush that the whole thing was really from God, but that a person couldn't possibly have been able to know what was in the dream without God's intervention. And that's why he fell on his face before Daniel, not as though, he says, like someone who's bowing down to God. And he also gave the command to offer, right, the mincha, the milchochin, and nesech, etc., to offer sacrifices, like Kimo, somebody who's offering to God. But, and he relates it to that Badai, okay, to the verse that we just had. And then he says, but it doesn't make sense, because he reminds us that we know that Nebuchadnezzar is considered a chacham. And it's highly improbable, says the Ramat Vali, that someone who's truly wise could make the mistake of thinking that somebody whose flesh and blood is on the level of a deity. All right. Why is that? He says, I was okay. Right here. It says it's unlikely he would fall into such a great error, because somebody who is flesh and blood, right? He says, who is a deity, or what is the essence of being God? The essence of being God is somebody who has the makor chayim lahachayot et achirim. Somebody who is the source of life, who gives sustenance and life to others. And it can't possibly be a human being, okay, who doesn't have this possibility. And furthermore, in the end, a human being is going to die. And anything that's going to end, that isn't eternal, can't possibly be God. And Nebuchadnezzar knows this, because he's not stupid, and he's not going to fall into all sorts of emotional traps, because he's a chacham. And it would be, he says it would be, like a bizayon, it would be disparaging and impinging on his own honor of a king like this to be bowing down to one of his servants. So he says that Nebuchadnezzar's intent from the very beginning, okay, was that he was bowing down not to Daniel himself, but this to the, but that he was bowing down in recognition of God and of the revelation that God had just made there in that place by giving this nevuah, this power of nevuah to Daniel. All right. And he goes on now. So then how is he going to explain? So what is the king answering? Right? It's still the same words. The king is answering Daniel and he's saying, it's true that you're God, but what is the answering? So the Ramat Valley says you can see explicitly that Nebuchadnezzar is revealing his intent, that all of this bowing down and korbanot, etc., were not done for Daniel because he immediately is talking about God. Okay, so he doesn't have to have this, and that what he's not bowing down to Daniel himself, rather to the God that Eloka Elyon, the high God who is milubash b'da'ato, who is, in other words, that God's high wisdom is enclosed in Daniel. There's this nitzotz of godliness, right? The Tzelem Elokim, which is milubash in the seichel of a person. And he thought, now this is something that's kind of interesting. He thought that by means of this, that he could make it his own. Okay. And that he could also sort of pay off any debt that he might have towards Daniel as a person. It's like, hello, no, you have infinite debt to Kadosh Baruch Hu because Kadosh Baruch Hu is giving you life every moment. But Nebuchadnezzar is not quite willing to really acknowledge that. So he's like, he acknowledges and he doesn't acknowledge. It's a very interesting, both intellectual and it's an intellectual tension that he has. On the one hand, he's smart enough to realize that God is beyond, and that there are things that an eternal God can do, does do, that he, no matter how great a king he is, can't approach. And on the other hand, he doesn't really like the idea that there's anything that's greater than he is. Okay? And we're going to see that in the next chapter. He's very much like, like the Nimrod story and building the tower to fight against God. It's like, on the one hand, he's thankful to God. And on the other hand, he just wants to be paid off. It's like, okay, fine. You gave me this. That's great. But he wants to be free of that. He doesn't want to have an ongoing relationship with this almighty God that then he has to take at best second place. And to be honest, human beings take, I don't know, I mean, maybe second place is where human beings are, right? But Nebuchadnezzar doesn't like this. But he does acknowledge. And so even though at this point, and so then what does he do? What does the Ramat Valley do with the other two verses? He says, however, the king recognizes that it is necessary to give honor to the person who merited this, to be the kli, to be the vessel of the godly revelation. And so that's why he gives it to Daniel. So he's explaining it on a somewhat different level. And he does bring in the example of Yosef. And he says that it has to do with the Yirat Elokim, which is in the heart. So, and where did that come from? So he's reminding us, we saw back in the first chapter, Daniel goes through all these machinations in order not to eat the tamei food. All right. Yosef didn't have as much of a problem with that in Mitzrayim. We don't hear a lot about it. And he didn't have as much of a problem because the Mitzrayim didn't eat meat. And so he did still have to worry about not eating something that they had offered to their idols. But he didn't have to, and he wasn't likely to be offered wine while he was a slave. So he wasn't in the same kind of position that Daniel was in. Daniel, we said, had the concern that because he was being groomed as a teenager, right? He's already being groomed to be an advisor to the king, to be part of the court. There's a problem that you might forget who you are and try to assimilate. And so he and his friends took it upon themselves not to eat that patbag hamelach, not to drink from the mishteh yeno of the king. And that's, according to the early sources, the halachot that eventually get put into place of not eating anything other than Bishul Yisrael, or not eating stam, not drinking stam yenam, those all come from Daniel, right? And the Ramat Valley here is telling us that that it was because he was so careful about guarding his mouth from these tamei foods and non-kosher food, etc., that he was worthy of being able to speak with that same mouth. He was now worthy of being able to speak, and he makes the parallel to Yosef, who Yosef wasn't tempted in terms of food and drink, but he was tempted by Potiphar's wife, and he also had to guard himself from things which were forbidden. And both of them, as a result of the Mesirat Nefesh that they had, were zocha to greatness because of their Yirat Shamayim. Right? This is it. As always, it ties back to the Kedushat Levi. I didn't think the Kedushat Levi and Sefer Daniel had anything to do with one another, or at least not so intimately. And yet, exactly what we talked about last Thursday, Ki Tzadik Moshel Yirat Elokim, right? And that was just what we were explaining again, that the tzaddik rules over God. How? By means of his Yirat Elokim, by means of his being aware that God is aware. He's able not only to, right, we had talked about the tzaddik goes there, v'kadosh baruch hu mekayim, but he's even able to overturn God's gezerot, negative gezerot. The tzaddik's able to overturn them. All right. And that's exactly what we talked about last week, and also back in Parshat Noach and with the Kedushat Levi. And here it is in the Ramat Valley specifically about Daniel and Yosef, that because they maintained an awareness of God's awareness of them, and they maintained this awareness, this yira of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So then they were able to, first of all, they ruled over themselves. Secondly, they both became the word that we had in Sefer Daniel is that hashlate. He made him rule. In Parshat Miketz, we're told that Paro makes Yosef to be the shalitu mashbir. And again, so it's that same shorsh. He makes him be the ruler over the whole land. And so it's the same sort of thing. And specifically the issue of being the Rav Signin over all of the Chachamim, which is this is the appropriate kind of rule, says. Now, Ramat Valley is going into a level more pnimi of it, right? That this is the kind of shlita which is appropriate to him. Okay, because it says he was preferable to them, but if you just stop and think about it, why is it ruya? Sometimes we think that we have no control over, what does it mean to have control over chachamim, to have control over chachma? I'm in charge of what I think about. Not only am I in charge of what I put into my mouth, and not only am I in charge of what comes out of my mouth, but I'm in charge about what I think about. I'm in charge of what kind of wisdoms, what kinds of thoughts I think about. And so the king, which king, right? It doesn't actually say, if you go back to that verse, it doesn't actually say which king puts, all were Chachmei Bavel, but it doesn't. Let's just go back to the verses, right? And so here in verse 48, it just says the Malka, the king, does this. And so the king gives you, each of us, control over what we think about, over what goes in and also what comes out. All right. I would like to make some progress into chapter 3, unless there are any questions about chapter 2. And you're the only person who's on. So you need to tell me if you have any questions about your Meira. Everybody else is going to ask their questions by email. Tonight, you're the only one here. Okay. So chapter 3, we're going to get started. You may recognize this story. I'm going to read it in the Aramaic and translate it mostly to English, to some extent to Hebrew, because I do have some Hebrew speakers, like that's their first language, not English, their first language, who are also going to be joining with this. So what happened, I titled this video something like who to worship. Okay, so we started off with this little piece of, is Nebuchadnezzar going to worship Daniel? And Daniel's like, oh, no, you don't. Not me. Not me. This is all God. It's from God. It's not me. You are not worshiping me. And even if you read it with the Ramat Valley, who says, no, Nebuchadnezzar never intended to be worshiping a human. He knows better than that. But we also see that Nebuchadnezzar didn't particularly, he wanted to not have to worship God. So, but now what's going to happen? Okay, we Jews speak about the Tzelem Elokim because of our story in Genesis, where it's God says, let's make man b'tzelmeno, in our image. All right. So this Tzelem is an image. And now we're going to get the story, which may or may not be familiar to you. It leads into the story of the Kivshan Ha'esh. Okay. The story of the fiery furnace. just so that you know where we're going to. All right. Nebuchadnezzar Malka. Avad Slaim Didahav. Rume Amin Shitin Ktaye Amin Shit. Ktaye Amin Shit. Akema Bikat Dura Vimidat Bavel. Nebuchadnezzar the king made a tselem, in this case, like an idol, or at least a pesel, a statue, which was of gold. Okay, D is the same word as a share. Zahav, that's that Dalet Zayin switch that we see. Rume, its height, Rom, its height is 60 amma. Ptaye, its width is, and I don't know if that means its total circumference or width, and then we're not talking about depth at all, but let's say that it's more or less, it's like a pillar kind of shape, but it's a tselem, all right, is only 6 amma. Now, something which is 60 tall, in other words, it's 1 wide for every 10 tall. So it's fairly narrow. And something like that, it's actually very interesting. I guess part of this is because I've learned stuff in Baba Batra and other places where it talks about like how the temple was made and this, that, and the other, and how wide, how thick does a wall have to be in order to support a certain height. And the taller something is, the broader the base needs to be in order to support that height. So to only be 6 around and to be 60 tall is actually, without any supporting bracing kinds of stuff, is actually not, it's a pretty good feat of engineering to actually get something like that to stand. Let's put it that way. Anyway, so we had this thing that was 60 tall and 6 around or 6 wide, and he had it erected. He caused it to be erected in the valley of Dura, which is in the country of Bavel. And the valley of Dura didn't. So if you think about things, if you put something up, I don't know, and there are mountains and stuff around, so the mountains will block it from one way or another. If you put something up in a city, like, you know, they put up that crazy, the cord bridge is what they call it, Gesher HaMetarim, to help hold the train. And it was supposed to be this landmark kind of thing in Yerushalayim. But then there are all these big buildings in the way. So from most parts of the city, you can barely see any of it because it's blocked by other buildings. It's blocked because there's, you know, the city has hills and mountains in it, and you're on the wrong side of it. So it's supposed to be something that draws the eye, that's iconic of the new Jerusalem, and you can't see it. So it's like, what good did that do? Nebuchadnezzar put it in a valley and in a valley that was mostly farmland. So there's no other tall structure, and you have something which is 60 amma tall, it's like 30 meters. All right, 30 meters tall, and there's nothing anywhere nearby to block it. And so it's visible to all of the surrounding cities because it's in this valley. That's the point there. Nebuchadnezzar Malchus Shalach L'Nichnas La'achash Dar Pnaya Signaya Ufachvata Adar Gzaria Gdavraya. Oh man, these are hard to say. Gdavraya Tifteya V'kol Shiltone Medinata Lamate la Chanukat Salma di Hakim Nebuchadnezzar Malka. So Nebuchadnezzar the king sent to Limechnash is like lahachnis, okay, shin sin switch, to gather together. And these are different kinds of officers. They're just different kinds of titles, and even when it gets translated into Hebrew, they just leave it exactly the same as it is, and they make it achashtar panim. Okay, in other words, this word, the pachvata, is actually, that's the word. It's made its way into English as a pasha. Pasha. It's a title that gets used in Arab-speaking countries. Actually, gets used in India also. Pasha is it's like a governor general kind of person, etc. Anyway, so there are all these different kinds of officers and advisors. That's these adargazraya, excuse me, are advisors, and Gedavraya, because the Daled Zion switch is Gizbarim. Okay, so that the people who are in charge of the money, okay, etc., and all of the rulers of the various cities that are subordinate to him. And he says that they should come to the inauguration of this tzelem that Nebuchadnezzar the king has had erected. And then once they're all together, Vadayin, Mitkanshin, Shuvpam, I have to pronounce all this stuff. Okay. Achashtar Pnaya, Signayu, Fachvata, Adar, Gazaraya, Gdavraya, Ditavraya, Tiftaya. Same people. V'kol Shiltanei Medinat Chanukat Salma. They all come together to this inauguration of the Tzelem, Di Hakim Nebuchadnezzar Malka. It's like, why did you have to repeat all that? You called them together and they came. You couldn't just say, and they came, right? Hi, Rivka. We're almost done, Lovey. No, she's not even connected yet. We'll see. Hi, we're almost done. Anyway, so that Nebuchadnezzar had erected in order to lekavel Salma di Hakim Nebuchadnezzar. So they all came and they're opposite. Lekavel here, it does not, it's like, means to be opposite. It doesn't mean to hear, because that's also a possible meaning of kuf bet lamed lekabel, like to receive something, but it also has to do with being like makbil, being in parallel or being opposite to something. So they stood there at this inauguration event. What's going on at this inauguration event? Lachon Amrin Amamaya Umaya Lishnaya, and a decree was read out to all of them, and it said, and each one was said of, and it's the language that we get again in the Megillah of, you know, Kol Medina Medina, Kol Am Va'am, Kol, you know, every, and Lashon V'Lashon. So, oops. She was having problems with the internet. Okay. And so this is just the Aramaic equivalent of that kind of phrasing, that the announcement was made over and over again in all the different languages, to all the different nations, to all of the different peoples. Okay. And so we've got this huge statue that's made of gold that can be seen from everywhere. And he gathers together all of the rulers and he tells them, and now he makes this announcement. And what does it say? V'idana di tishmon kal karna mashrokita katros shabacha psanteri. So not a piano. It sounds like it, but it's not. Symphony. That's where the word symphony comes from. V'kol zanei zimra. Tiflun tiskadun l'tzelin dahava di hakim Nebuchadnezzar Malka. And he says to them, this is the announcement that's made in all the different languages and all the different ways of understanding it in high language and in common speech, etc. That at the time that you will hear the voice of the horn and of the cymbals and it's not actually a piano, even though that's the word that we now use for piano, psanter, right? Symphonia. When you hear this loud music, like dun 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 kind of thing, whatever the particular motif that was going to be used, and all these different calls on a zimra, all these different kinds of musical instruments, you will fall, you will prostrate, right? We talked about sagan, tiskadon, you will prostrate yourselves to this gold image that Nebuchadnezzar the king has erected. Now, think about if the Ramat Valley thought that Nebuchadnezzar was too smart to think that you could possibly really worship a human being because human beings are going to die, does it make any sense at all that he thinks that that he really thinks in his mind of minds, heart of hearts, that you should worship something made out of gold that human beings can make? Like, this is not about Nebuchadnezzar worshiping the tzela. Okay, this is about Nebuchadnezzar exerting power over everybody else and saying, this is, you need to show signs of worship to this because I say so, because I'm the one who erected it, right? This is that, in a sense, this is his taking that Rosh Shel Zahav. God vouchsafed him this dream, which Daniel translated for him and explained to him. And he said to him, you are that Rosh Shel Zahav. But your problem here is that Nebuchadnezzar has the opportunity immediately following hearing this from Daniel. And we're going to see he actually has this sort of on-off relationship with Daniel and with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. He has the opportunity to take it to Kedusha, even though he's already destroyed the Beit HaMikdash. He did that as God's messenger because the Beit HaMikdash needed to be destroyed. Nebuchadnezzar has the potential to take it to Kedusha, and he over and over again decides that he doesn't want to, and he takes it to Klippa. It's a whole sipur with him over and over again. So this is one of those things. It's like, okay, well, I've essentially, like we said, I've paid God off. I've put Daniel, who is God's, prophet, whatever, I've given him a good position, but now I'm going to reassert myself. And after all, I'm this Rosh Shel Zahav. So that's why this tzelem is made out of gold. Also because it's very shiny and it would catch the light and it would be seen by everywhere because it's in this valley, which so can be seen throughout all of Bavel. At any rate, so when you hear all of this, then that's when you You need to bow down. And then he says, "Uman dila yipol yiskud," and whoever does not fall and prostrate himself, ba sha'ata yitrama lego aton nura yakadata. So at that time, he's going to be thrown into a, basically, this is the fiery furnace. Okay, nura is ash, or, and yakadata is something which has been ignited, so it's the fiery furnace. That's the decree that was made. Kol kavel dana bazimna kadei shamin kol amamaya kal karna mashrot kita katos shav kapsantarin kol zane zimra. Okay, again. And everybody, you'd think we heard this already once, and it keeps repeating. And so at that time when they heard, when all the people would hear this, the sound of the horns and the shriek, the blowing of the katkos and the playing of this thing that they called the psanter and all these other kinds of instruments, all the people, naflin kol amamaya, umaya v'lishnaya. Interesting. So there are people who are connected because they're an they come from, they're together with one another. There are people who are called umaya, which are nations, okay, from like Le'um. And Lishnaya, there are people who, what they have in common with one another is that they belong to the same language group. Okay, so it's different ways of people identifying themselves into groups. And so all of these kinds of groups, all of them, Satin, Litzel, Dahava, Dihakim, Nebuchadnezzar Malk. And so everybody bowed down to this gold statue that Nebuchadnezzar the king had erected. Kol kavel dana, nonetheless, right? Bezimna krivu guvrin kastayin va'achlu kartzehon di Yehudaya. So at the same time, the Kasdim men, Kasdim are, right, like, or Kasdim, it's where Avram Avinu came from. But Kasdim were also, those really are what we call the Bablim. They called themselves Kasdim. So they came together, and here's this interesting phrase of Achlu Kartzehon. The other place that this shows up is in Vayikra, in Parshat Kedoshim. Anybody who took that class by Shiviti, so we talked about it. It means they ate their winks. You know, like they're winking, and we saw a number of different meanings by it. It's basically people who are balei lashon hara. And so one meaning that Chazal gave for the business of eating their winks is that because they had juicy gossip, you know, they would go and they would earn their meal by sharing juicy gossip. But the issue of it being winks is that it's like you can say something that if all you have is the transcript of what was said, it doesn't sound so bad. But because of the, you know, nudge, nudge, wink, wink kind of thing, it gives over other kind of, you know, like everybody's bowing down. Yeah, right? The Jews too, right? Okay. And that's what they were doing, is they were doing Lashon Hara against the Jews, because Jews don't bow down to anybody we don't even prostrate ourselves, except for on Yom Kippur, we still have a remnant of the prostration as a remembrance of what was going on in the Beit HaMikdash, and not even all communities do that. Hasidim and Sephardim do. Ashkenazim do it much less. And we're very careful not to actually bow down on any kind of a stone or tile surface. We put something else between us and it, because the only place where you were allowed to prostrate in that way was at the Beit HaMikdash itself. So the notion that a Jew would, no matter where he was, fall and prostrate himself is highly unlikely. And so they were, I mean, Lashon Hara doesn't mean that they were telling falsehoods, right? It means that they were trying to get people into trouble by their speech or by their wink, wink, nudge, nudge kind of thing. And Anu, the Amrin Nebuchadnezzar Malka la'almin hayeh. And so they spoke up and they said to Nebuchadnezzar, it's like, did you hear? And this one heard. And so then nobody is the original source. No, I heard it from this one and I heard it from that one. So first they spoke among themselves, so to speak, so that they could get free of being held responsible. Because now what's really going on, right? Part of what's going on here is that they're very jealous of Daniel and of Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, who Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who were put in charge of them, and Daniel, who was put in charge of all of the Chachamim, etc. Just on the pshat level of this story. And so they were very not happy with this whole thing. And so they come to Nebuchadnezzar and they say to Nebuchadnezzar, "O king, Malka la'almin chayeh. King, you should live forever. And Malka Santa Ta'an di Kol Enash di Yishma Kal Karna Mashrokita Katros Shabchab Santrin." And we had Symphonia. We actually had the mem in it in the first place. This one is without the mem, Suponia, but it's still that Symphonia idea. Who calls on a Zimra? Yipov Yisgad L'Tzalem Zahava. You, O king, gave a reason, gave a command that every person who hears this, the announcement, the musical announcement, is supposed to fall and bow and prostrate themselves to the gold image. Umandila Yipov Yisgad Yitrume Lego Atun Nura Iakarta, and that whoever does not fall and prostrate is going to be thrown into a fiery furnace. And so Itai Guvrin Yehudai Di Manita Yaton Ala Vidat Not Bavel Shadrach Meshach Abednego Guvraya Ilen La Samu Alach Malka Te'em Lelakach La Palchin L'Tzelen Dahavadi Hakimata La Sagdin. That, by the way, there are these Jewish people. Okay, or I'm translating Yehudain as Jews. There are these people from Judea that you appointed them over the work of your kingdom and the servants of your kingdom. You put them in charge over all the country of Bavel. Okay, specifically Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men didn't pay attention. They didn't accept the king's rule. And they didn't worship the Tzelem. They didn't accept the king's rule, Rather, their God, right, to work, lelahach la palchin. Your God, they're not worshiping. Okay, as though, okay, now we said that especially with the Roman Valid's reading, it's highly unlikely that Nebuchadnezzar really thinks of this Tzelem as being his God. This is a power play, but everybody else is seeing it as Nebuchadnezzar has started some new religion, as it were, and the Tzelem is this Tzelem to the Hav is the image for this new religion. And so he says to them, this is what's going on. And they're not worshiping Falchi. They're not worshiping it. And they're not prostrating themselves to this. And I am past time by 5 minutes. So I kind of hate to stop us in the middle of the story, but you can see where it's about to go. All right. And so we are going to stop here. And next time I'll give some, more pnimi, et cetera, kind of explanation for what I've gone through of the story so far. And then we'll go on and we'll get to the rest of the story. But you can see what's happening, right? These Malshinim, these people have told us that, or have told the king that these Jews aren't obeying the king's command to bow down to the Tzelem. And you said that anybody who doesn't bow down is going to get thrown into the fiery furnace. So what's happening, okay? And hopefully you already know the story, but we will pursue it further next week. Thank you both for joining me.
Building up the whole tension.
Huh?
Building up the whole tension.
Yes, building up the whole tension. That's where we're holding off. And Miriam, I'm so glad you got here at the very end, but we're getting off now.
I was here before then too. I just didn't show my face.
No, I'm talking to Miriam, who is also here just now, and I think she just got on. At any rate, I'll tell both of you, I'm going to add this to the original playlist. I'm not going to make a separate playlist. I'm going to do all of Sefer Daniel. It'll be a whole year's worth of videos in the end, but I'm going to do all of Sefer Daniel in one playlist. Okay. So you already have the link to the playlist, although I will try to send it out again. Thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate it. And I look forward to seeing you all both in person when possible and online when not. Okay. Hatzlacha Rava.
Thank you.
Pitka Tova. If I can still say it after. It's just a day after Zot Chanukah, right? Love y'all. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Okay. Stop the share.